He was just a quiet teenager who never talked much in class, until his teacher humiliated him in front of everyone, shouting that he would never succeed in life. But just a few days later, that same teacher was called into the principal's office and found out the shocking truth. The student she had mocked wasn't just any kid. He was the creator of a secret project that had already made him a millionaire and was about to change the entire education system. What happened next turned the whole school upside down and left even the teacher speechless. Before we go any further, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a powerful story here on Waves of Justice, where every story reminds us that truth always finds its way. The classroom of Elmridge High always smelled like chalk and impatience. That morning, sunlight slid through the tall windows, cutting across rows of restless students who were waiting for the final grades of the term. At the center of it all sat Nolan Gray, a quiet 17-year-old whose calm eyes made people uneasy. He wasn't the type who argued or showed off, but his silence often felt like defiance to those who misunderstood him. His desk was covered in neat sketches of mobile screens and bits of code scribbled on sticky notes. While others whispered about weekend plans, Nolan was fixing a small error on his laptop before the teacher noticed. Mrs. Callan, the strictest teacher in Elmridge, marched in with her grade book hugged against her chest. Her heels clicked like a countdown. She had taught for 20 years and believed that discipline was the only path to success. To her, students like Nolan, quiet, distracted, always staring at screens, were trouble waiting to happen. She stopped at his desk, frowning at the glow of his laptop. "Nolan," she said sharply, "am I interrupting something important?" The class snickered. Nolan closed his screen slowly, keeping his voice steady. "Just finishing the project you assigned, ma'am." Mrs. Callan raised a brow. "The project was due yesterday. You didn't submit it, and excuses won't earn you marks." Nolan tried to explain, but before he could, she waved him off. "You always think the rules don't apply to you. You sit there hiding behind that computer. But let me tell you, success requires effort, not shortcuts." She slapped her gradebook onto his desk, her voice echoing through the room. "You'll never succeed if you can't even follow instructions." The laughter that followed was short and awkward, the kind that fills silence when people feel guilty for enjoying someone else's embarrassment. Nolan didn't look up. His hands rested on the desk, steady as stone. When class ended, Nolan waited until the room was empty. He opened his laptop again, the same one Mrs. Callan had nearly confiscated a week ago. The screen flickered to life, revealing lines of clean code and a dashboard that showed live numbers climbing higher by the minute. A soft beep announced another milestone, 1,043,212 users online. Nolan's expression didn't change, but his shoulders straightened just a little. He typed a short message in a chat window labeled Team Core. It read, "Fix patch delay. Media feature rolls Friday." Then he closed the screen again. The secret's safe for now. As he left the room, Mrs. Callan's words followed him in the back of his mind like a splinter. "You'll never succeed." He didn't hate her for saying it. He almost felt sorry for her because she had no idea what kind of world he was already building beyond that classroom. Outside, the wind carried the sound of students laughing near the courtyard. Nolan walked past them quietly, his backpack slung low, phone buzzing in his pocket. The message preview flashed. "Meeting confirmed with Marintech investors. Friday, 4 p.m. He smiled faintly, just once, before slipping the phone back into his pocket and heading toward the bus stop. No one at Elmridge High knew that the quiet boy who never raised his hand was running something far bigger than any of them could imagine. And the one person who doubted him most was about to find out in the most unexpected way. The next morning, Elmridge High buzzed with the kind of noise that came from half-finished gossip. Someone had posted a blurry picture of Nolan sitting alone after class, his laptop open, light from the screen washing over his face. The caption read, "Still thinks he's smarter than Mrs. Callan." By the time the first bell rang, the photo had spread through half the senior class group chat. Nolan saw it when he got to school, glanced at it once, and locked his phone without a word. He had been insulted before. Words didn't bother him. Delays did, and right now he had one. His app, LoopMind, had exploded faster than he ever expected. What started as a small study aid tool for his classmates had turned into a platform used by schools across 3 states. Now investors wanted meetings, companies wanted partnerships, and his small online team worked night shifts fixing bugs. But none of that mattered if he failed his final exams and lost his scholarship offer to Bransley Tech Institute. Grades still ruled the world he was stuck in, even if his code had already crossed it. Mrs. Callan stood at the whiteboard when he entered, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Class, today we're presenting final evaluations. Please be ready, and no personal devices this time." Her eyes flicked toward Nolan for a split second, sharp and warning. He nodded silently and took his seat near the back. Mina, the only person in school who really knew about his project, leaned over and whispered, "The post went viral last night. You okay?" Nolan shrugged. People forget fast. But Mina knew him better. He only said that when he was planning something. When his turn came, Nolan walked to the front carrying nothing but a flash drive. Mrs. Callan watched suspiciously as he plugged it into the classroom computer. The projector flickered on, showing the title slide, "LoopMind, Making Study Smarter." A few students snickered. "Oh, great, another app," someone muttered. Mrs. Callan crossed her arms. "You made this yourself?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Nolan replied evenly. "From scratch." He began explaining how it worked, how LoopMind analyzed study patterns, reduced distraction, and linked students for collaborative prep sessions. The slides were clean, data clear, and examples real. Still, Mrs. Callan's tone stayed cold. "Impressive graphics," she said. "But ideas are one thing, results are another. Did you test it?" Nolan paused, knowing what she expected. "Yes, I run a beta group," he said quietly. "Over 1 million users." Laughter broke out. One student whispered, "1 million imaginary friends." Mrs. Callan didn't even smile. "Let's stay realistic, Mr. Gray. You can't just claim things without proof." Nolan said nothing more. He removed the flash drive, shut down the screen, and returned to his seat. The class continued as if nothing had happened, but Mina saw his jaw tighten, the only sign of emotion he allowed himself. When the bell rang, Mrs. Callan stopped him at the door. "Ambition is good," she said, her tone softer but still condescending. "But until you learn to follow real rules, you'll just be another dreamer with half-finished projects." Nolan met her gaze for the first time that morning. "Maybe," he said quietly, "or maybe the rules just need an update." He left before she could respond. That afternoon, as the halls emptied, a black sedan parked quietly outside the school gates. A woman in a gray coat stepped out, speaking into her earpiece. "Yes, confirm that the founder is on site. His name's Nolan Gray. Schedule the presentation for Friday at the school auditorium." She closed the car door and looked up at the building. Her badge glinted in the sunlight. Marintech Investments. The day after the gray car appeared outside Elmridge High, the school halls felt different. Students whispered more than usual, teachers looked distracted, and even the principal had been seen talking nervously on his phone. No one knew what was happening, but everyone could sense that something unusual was brewing. Nolan arrived quietly, earbuds in, his laptop slung under one arm. He noticed the tension right away but said nothing. He preferred silence. It gave him room to think. When he reached his locker, Mina was waiting for him, holding a folded sheet of paper. "You've got to see this," she said, her eyes wide. It was an official school notice. Career Futures Assembly. Friday, 2 p.m. Special guest, corporate representative from Marintech. Nolan read it twice and then looked at her. "They're coming here?" He asked, though he already knew the answer. Mina nodded. "Apparently to announce a partnership with some local student project. Guess which one?" Nolan sighed. "I told them to wait for next month's expo." She grinned. "Well, looks like they didn't." At lunch, Nolan sat at the far table by the window, while the cafeteria hummed with rumors. Some said the guest was coming to recruit top students. Others joked it was a secret inspection. Mrs. Callan sat at the teacher's table, glancing across the room occasionally, still thinking about the presentation from the day before. Something about the boy's calm confidence unsettled her. She had seen students boast before, but Nolan's certainty wasn't arrogance. It was quiet truth. Yet her pride wouldn't let her admit she might have been wrong. Later that afternoon, Nolan found a note on his desk. Principal wants to see you. 3 p.m. The handwriting was unfamiliar. He arrived at the office on time. The principal, Mr. Breen, looked uneasy as he motioned him inside. Nolan, he began carefully, we've been contacted by a company named Marintech. They claim to be working with your platform? Nolan nodded. Yes, sir. Breen adjusted his glasses. They want to feature your project at the assembly. Is that true? Nolan hesitated. It wasn't the plan, but I suppose it's happening now. The principal's expression shifted between confusion and amazement. Son, do you realize how big this is? The board is thrilled, but your teacher, Mrs. Callan, reported your project for academic misconduct yesterday. She believed it wasn't your original work. Nolan froze. She reported me? Breen nodded, his voice low. She thought she was following protocol, but now the situation's complicated. The board is looking into both claims, hers and Marintech's. Nolan sat quietly, his face calm, though his mind raced. The irony almost made him smile. Mrs. Callan had tried to stop him, and now her complaint would bring the very people she feared straight into her classroom. He stood up slowly. Thank you for telling me, sir. I'll be ready for Friday. The principal looked puzzled. Ready for what? Nolan replied, for the truth to explain itself. Then he walked out, leaving Mr. Breen staring after him. That evening, in his small bedroom filled with sticky notes and glowing monitors, Nolan's phone buzzed with a message from Mina. They just confirmed Marintech's lead investor is coming herself. Don't tell anyone yet. He typed back, let her come. It's time. Across town in her tidy apartment, Mrs. Callan reviewed her grade sheets, convincing herself she had done the right thing. Rules are rules, she whispered. But deep inside, for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she believed that anymore. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere at Elmridge High felt like a stretched rubber band ready to snap. Everyone was talking about the upcoming Career Futures Assembly, and each rumor sounded wilder than the last. Some students claimed a company was offering jobs to teenagers. Others said a student's project was being bought for millions. No one had proof, but every whisper seemed to circle back to the same name, Nolan Gray. Nolan moved through the crowd like a shadow, earbuds in, head down, pretending not to hear. He had learned that staying quiet gave people more to think about than defending himself ever could. Mina kept pace beside him, trying to match his calm. They're talking like you built a spaceship, she said lightly. Nolan smiled faintly. Let them. It's better than them thinking I'm lying. But not everyone was content to let the mystery sit. Mrs. Callan had spent half the night scrolling through educational forums, trying to find any sign of a similar project. She searched for LoopMine, for Student Study App, even for Nolan's name. Nothing. It made her uneasy. She had built her entire career on identifying cheaters, on catching shortcuts before they damaged a student's future. Yet this time, she couldn't find proof of wrongdoing, just silence. And that silence scared her more than guilt ever could. When she entered her classroom that morning, Nolan was already there, reviewing something on his laptop. The sight made her pulse quicken. Mr. Gray, she said stiffly. A word. The other students looked up, sensing tension. Nolan closed his laptop and stood politely. Yes, ma'am? She hesitated, torn between authority and curiosity. The principal informed me about tomorrow's assembly, she said carefully. It appears your project has gained attention. Nolan nodded once. So it seems. Her jaw tightened. You should have disclosed any external help. You know collaboration outside school policy violates the honor code. His voice stayed even. I didn't have help, Mrs. Callan. Just a small team of friends online. We built everything ourselves. Her eyes narrowed. And you expect me to believe that? He met her stare without blinking. You don't have to. Tomorrow will speak for itself. Before she could respond, the bell rang, and the hallway flooded with noise. Students hurried in, unaware of the quiet storm between them. As Nolan took his seat, Mrs. Callan stood frozen for a moment, staring at the boy she thought she understood. Something about his calm unsettled her more than any defiance could. That afternoon, Mina caught up with Nolan outside the computer lab. You think she'll try to stop you? She asked. Nolan shook his head. She already tried. Now it's too big for her to stop. Mina frowned. You don't sound nervous. He closed his laptop bag and looked out the window. I was nervous when this was just code. Now it's proof. While most students went home to study or waste time online, Nolan stayed late in the school library. The glow from his screen reflected off the glass walls, making him look like a ghost moving through blue light. He was fine-tuning the presentation that Marentech had insisted he give himself. He didn't like public speaking, but he understood power. Facts were powerful, numbers were louder than words, and the truth, when shown at the right time, could silence an entire room. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Mrs. Callan spoke with the principal again. I'm telling you, Breen, she said, her tone clipped. It doesn't add up. No high school student manages a company, not without someone doing it for him. The principal sighed. Marla, maybe we're underestimating this generation. The Marentech people confirmed the contract. The boy's name is on every document. Her stomach twisted. So what happens if this all goes public? What if he embarrasses the school? Breen shook his head. Or what if he makes it famous? Either way, we'll find out tomorrow. When she drove home that night, Mrs. Callan couldn't shake the thought that she might have crossed a line. Her reflection in the windshield looked tired, older than she remembered. She had wanted to protect her students from false hopes, not destroy one who might actually make it. Back in his small bedroom, Nolan set down his laptop and he stared at the message that had just appeared on his phone. It was from an unknown number. Tomorrow changes everything. Be ready. LM. He didn't need to guess who it was. The initials belonged to Laura Mendez, Marentech's lead investor. She was the one arranging the assembly, the one who had insisted he let the company take LoopMind public before graduation. Nolan placed the phone face down on the desk, closed his eyes for a long moment, and whispered to himself, let them see it. Across town, Mrs. Callan sat in her kitchen, her untouched dinner going cold. For the first time in 20 years of teaching, she wasn't sure whether she wanted to be right or wrong. Friday morning dawned gray and tense, as if even the weather knew Elmridge High was about to witness something no one would forget. The air felt heavier, charged with the restless energy of whispers and speculation. Students poured through the gates earlier than usual, their faces lit with excitement and curiosity. Banners for the Career Futures Assembly fluttered in the wind. Though no one seemed to care about the other guest speakers listed, every conversation came back to one topic, the mysterious student in Marentech. Nolan arrived quietly as he always did, his backpack slung low, a thin smile on his face that gave nothing away. His phone buzzed with messages, investors confirming attendance, his small remote team sending updates, and Mina reminding him to eat something. He ignored them all except hers. Already had breakfast, he texted back, though in truth he hadn't eaten a thing. Food didn't matter today. Proof did. Addery. He walked down the hall. The usual sneers and half-laugh comments were replaced by cautious stares. Some students greeted him differently, almost politely now. The same ones who mocked him 3 days ago were watching him like he had turned into someone else overnight. But he hadn't changed at all. He was still the quiet boy who coded between classes, still the kid teachers thought didn't try hard enough. The only difference was that now, people were starting to realize how much they had missed right in front of them. In her classroom, Mrs. Callan stood by the window, watching him cross the courtyard. Her chest tightened. She had spent half the night convincing herself that this assembly would expose whatever trick he had been hiding. Yet when she saw his calm, measured walk, doubt crept in again. He looks too sure, she muttered under her breath. She turned back to her desk, trying to distract herself with papers she wasn't reading. The clock ticked too slowly. The assembly was only hours away, but each minute felt like an accusation. At lunch, Mina joined Nolan at their usual table, sliding him a small brown envelope. Backup drive, she whispered. Everything you need if the system crashes. Nolan smiled faintly. You think I'm worried about a crash? She shrugged. You should be. Some people would rather see you fail than watch you prove them wrong. He looked at her, appreciation flickering in his eyes. That's why I have you. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, murmurs were spreading among the staff. Some praised the school for attracting a corporate sponsor. Others whispered about favoritism. Mrs. Callan sat stiffly in the corner, listening. "They're saying the student's invention caught national attention," said Mr. Rhodes, the math teacher. "Apparently, the company's planning to fund a new innovation program here." Another teacher added, "I heard he's earning more than the principal." Laughter followed, but Mrs. Callan's stomach churned. She pressed her palms together, hiding how badly they were shaking. By early afternoon, the auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, local reporters, even school board members filled every seat. The Marintech team set up sleek displays at the front, their logo glowing on the projector screen. Among them stood a tall woman with dark hair pulled back neatly, Laura Mendez. Her voice carried authority even when she wasn't speaking. Every movement was deliberate, every expression measured. When the principal greeted her, she smiled politely but looked past him, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Nolan. He stood near the side stage, adjusting his laptop, the faint light from the screen reflecting on his calm face. Mina hovered nearby, checking cables, whispering small reminders. When Nolan saw Laura watching him, he nodded once. She returned the gesture, subtle and approving, like someone who already knew how the story would end. The principal took the stage first, clearing his throat nervously into the microphone. "Good afternoon, students, teachers, and honored guests. Today's assembly is special. We have with us representatives from Marintech Industries, a leader in technology and innovation. They're here to highlight the work of one of our very own students, someone who has shown creativity, intelligence, and determination." The crowd erupted in chatter. The principal smiled awkwardly and continued, "It is my pleasure to introduce Nolan Gray." A murmur spread through the hall as Nolan walked onto the stage. Some clapped, some whispered, and others just stared. He didn't rush. His steps were steady, his eyes forward. He stopped at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and waited for the room to fall silent. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'll keep this short." Behind him, the projector came to life, displaying the title, LoopMine, built by students for students. The first slide showed screenshots of the app interface, then graphs of user growth, and finally a live counter ticking rapidly upward. 189,000 users and climbing. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the teachers leaned forward. Mrs. Callan's mouth went dry. Nolan spoke clearly, his voice calm but strong. He explained how LoopMine started as a small tool to help classmates study together, how it grew into a system connecting thousands of schools. "It wasn't easy," he said, "but we believed students could create solutions for their own problems instead of waiting for someone else to fix them." He paused, scanning the audience until his eyes found Mrs. Callan. "Sometimes people tell you what you can't do," he continued, "and sometimes that's exactly the reason you do it anyway." A wave of murmurs spread through the hall. Laura Mendez smiled faintly where she stood. The numbers on the screen jumped again, crossing another milestone. For the first time since she'd started teaching, Mrs. Callan couldn't move. Every word, every slide, every number struck her harder than the last. The student she had dismissed as careless was standing in front of the entire school, proving her wrong in the one way she could never deny, through facts. And Nolan hadn't finished yet. The silence that followed Nolan's last words felt louder than any applause. For a brief moment, everyone just stared. Students, teachers, even the Marintech staff. It was as if no one quite knew how to react. Then the room erupted. Whispers turned into cheers, and clapping spread through the crowd like a wave. Nolan didn't smile. He simply stepped back from the microphone and waited for the noise to settle. His calmness made him seem older than he was, as if he had already expected every reaction that followed. At the edge of the stage, Mina's hands trembled slightly as she worked the projector controls. Her heart was racing. She knew Nolan had planned a live demo, but she hadn't seen what he added overnight. When he gave her a small nod, she clicked the next slide. The screen switched to a live feed showing a simple dashboard. Schools signed up, study sessions logged, real-time performance reports. The counter at the bottom kept ticking upward, numbers blurring from their speed. Nolan turned back to the crowd. "Every one of those numbers," he said, "belongs to a student who thought they couldn't keep up. I built this for them because I used to be one of them." That line hit deeper than anyone expected. The students who had laughed at him 2 days ago were now silent. A few even looked ashamed. The principal was grinning, clearly realizing the school was about to appear in the news for something big. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked, and even the board members at the back whispered among themselves about sponsorships and headlines. But one person wasn't clapping, Mrs. Callan. She sat stiffly in the second row, her knuckles white around her notebook. The numbers were real. The interface was professional. The investor was standing right there. And yet part of her couldn't let go of the voice in her head that said, "You were wrong." She had built her entire identity on knowing which students would succeed and which would fade. To admit she'd misjudged Nolan meant admitting that she had stopped believing in her own purpose. Laura Mendez stepped forward and took the microphone. "Thank you, Nolan," she said warmly. Her voice carried authority, but it wasn't forced. When Marintech first received LoopMind's prototype, we assumed it came from a college lab. We were wrong. It came from a 17-year-old sitting in this very school. We didn't fund him out of charity. We partnered with him because his idea works. And as of this morning, LoopMind has been approved for integration across 12 school districts. The hall broke into fresh applause, louder this time, with a few shouts from the back. Nolan stepped aside while Laura continued speaking about innovation and youth empowerment. He didn't need to listen. He already knew what she'd say. He used the pause to glance toward Mrs. Callan. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on her lap, but her face had lost all color. He almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But not enough to forget the words she'd thrown at him that week. When Laura finished, the principal returned to the microphone, his voice trembling with excitement. "We're so proud to have a student like Nolan representing Elmridge High. This is a reminder that our young people are capable of extraordinary things." He gestured toward Mrs. Callan. "And of course, we thank our teachers for guiding and challenging them to reach their full potential." Mrs. Callan looked up sharply, her name catching her off guard. Everyone was clapping again, this time turning toward her with admiring eyes, assuming she had been the one who encouraged Nolan. The irony was suffocating. She forced a smile that felt like glass cracking. As the assembly ended, reporters rushed the stage, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Laura shielded Nolan from the crowd, escorting him toward the side exit with Mina trailing close behind. "You handled yourself well," Laura said as they stepped into the quiet hallway. "I've seen executives with less composure." Nolan nodded. "Thank you. I just wanted the truth clear before we went public." She paused. "The truth usually finds its way. You just gave it a push." Back in the auditorium, Mrs. Callan stayed seated as the room emptied. Her colleagues congratulated her in passing, unaware of the storm building inside her. When she finally stood, her legs felt heavy. She walked slowly toward the front of the room, where the projector still hummed faintly, the LoopMind logo glowing against the wall. For a long time she stared at it, trying to understand how she could have missed so much. She remembered the first time Nolan had joined her class, a quiet transfer student who barely spoke. She had assumed his silence meant laziness. When his assignments came in with near-perfect accuracy, she accused him of copying. When he coded in the back of the room, she marked him absent-minded. Every decision she'd made had been built on assumption, not evidence. Now the evidence was burning in blue light before her eyes. Meanwhile, in the empty hallway, Nolan and Mina packed up the equipment. Mina finally exhaled, laughing softly. "You just broke the internet, you know that?" He shrugged, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "It's not the internet I care about." "Then what?" she asked. He looked down the hall where faint light spilled from the auditorium doors. "The next line of code," he said. "There's always a next one." Before leaving, Nolan turned back toward the stage one last time. Through the open doors, he could see Mrs. Callan standing there, staring at the LoopMind logo. Their eyes met for a second, hers full of regret, his unreadable. He gave a slight nod, not of arrogance, but of quiet acknowledgement, and then walked away. For the first time in her career, Mrs. Callan didn't know whether the lesson that day had been for her students or for herself. The weekend after the assembly changed everything for Elmridge High. By Saturday morning, the story had already spread across news outlets, student blogs, and social media feeds. Headlines read, "High School Teen Builds $1 Million App," and "Elmridge Student Partners with Marintech." The school's website nearly crashed from the flood of visitors, and the principal's inbox overflowed with messages from reporters, parents, and education boards wanting interviews. To the outside world, it looked like a triumph. But inside the walls of Elmridge, things were far more complicated. Nolan spent most of that weekend locked in his room, surrounded by monitors. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing, and even Mina had to stop by his house just to make sure he was eating. "You're famous," she said, dropping a takeout bag on his desk. "And starving, apparently." Nolan smirked, pushing a keyboard aside. "I'm busy fixing the servers. Fame's useless if the system crashes." Mina rolled her eyes. "You're impossible. The world is calling you a genius, and you're here fighting error logs." He looked at her briefly and smiled. "That's what keeps it real." But beneath his calm, there was a quiet ache. He wasn't angry about Mrs. Callan's words anymore. He was thinking about what they represented. Every teacher, every adult who had dismissed him, every rule that boxed out ideas because they didn't fit the standard. He didn't want revenge. He wanted change. He wanted the system that made people like Mrs. Callan feel powerful to finally see its flaws. Across town, Mrs. Callan was living in the opposite kind of silence. Her phone had also been ringing all weekend, but for very different reasons. The school board wanted a written statement about her involvement in Nolan's success story. Reporters had emailed her, assuming she had been his mentor. Her colleagues congratulated her for shaping such talent, and every message, every smile, felt like a lie pressing heavier on her chest. She hadn't shaped Nolan. She had broken him down and called it guidance. Her apartment was tidy as always, but she moved through it like a stranger. On the dining table sat a copy of the Elm Ridge Gazette with Nolan's picture on the front page, standing on stage, calm and focused, with the caption, "The future begins here." She stared at it for a long time, tracing the image with her fingers. The same boy she had humiliated was now the school's pride, the district's rising star, the kind of student she had stopped believing existed. By Sunday evening, the weight of it all pushed her to do something she had never done before. She opened her laptop and began typing a message. It wasn't to the board or the press, it was to Nolan. She paused several times, deleting and rewriting. Words like sorry and mistake looked too small compared to what she had done. Finally, she settled on honesty. "Nolan, I owe you an apology. I misjudged you, and I let my pride speak louder than my reason. Watching you succeed made me realize how wrong I was. Not just about you, but about how I've treated students who didn't fit my idea of success. You taught me something I should have known long ago. Real teaching means listening too. Thank you for proving me wrong." Her hand trembled as she pressed send. For a long while, she just sat there, staring at the screen as if expecting it to answer back. Nolan received the email late that night. He read it twice, expression unreadable. Mina, sitting beside him, noticed the shift in his eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked. He turned the screen toward her. She read the message and whistled softly. "Didn't expect that, did you?" Nolan leaned back, exhaling. "No, but maybe she means it." "You gonna reply?" Mina asked. He thought for a moment. "Yeah, not to rub it in, just to close it right." He typed a simple line. "Thank you, Mrs. Callan. I accept your apology. Everyone learns somehow." He hit send and went back to his code, but Mina watched him carefully. "You know," she said, "most people would have wanted revenge." Nolan shrugged. "Revenge is loud. Change is quiet." Monday morning, when Mrs. Callan checked her inbox before class, Nolan's reply sat there like a mirror. She read it 3 times, her throat tightening. The forgiveness she didn't deserve was somehow heavier than any punishment she expected. She closed the laptop and sat for a while, staring at the window where the morning light touched the glass. For the first time in years, she felt small and strangely free. Later that week, the school received an official letter from Marintech. They were donating new computers, updated software, and creating an innovation lab named after the project that started it all, the LoopMind Center for Student Creators. The entire faculty celebrated, the board took credit, and reporters returned for another round of photos. When they asked Nolan for a comment, he said only, "This isn't about one student. It's about what happens when schools start believing in ideas again." At the ceremony, Mrs. Callan stood in the crowd, watching quietly from the back. When Nolan's speech ended, she approached him as everyone dispersed. He noticed her before she spoke. For a moment, neither said anything. Then she offered her hand. "You turned out to be quite the teacher after all," she said softly. Nolan shook her hand with a faint smile. We both learned something, I guess. As he walked away, Mrs. Callan looked up at the sign above the new lab doors. Loop Mine Center. For once, she felt no envy, no bitterness, only a strange kind of peace. The student she thought would never succeed had reminded her why she started teaching in the first place. And somewhere deep down, she understood that her harsh words had not broken Nolan. They had shaped the moment that would change them both forever. The following month was one of the most transformative times Elmridge High had ever seen. The Loop Mine Center was finished faster than anyone expected. A gleaming space with glass walls, modern computers, and work tables that made the old classrooms look ancient. The room buzzed every day with the hum of 3D printers, the clicking of keyboards, and the low murmur of students who suddenly believed their ideas mattered. The school had gone from sleepy to electric almost overnight. For the first time, Nolan found himself surrounded by people who wanted to listen instead of doubt. Students who had once mocked him were now asking for advice. Some wanted to join his app, team. Others wanted to build their own projects. Mina helped organize after-school sessions for new coders, and soon the Loop Mine Center became the most popular place on campus. There were moments Nolan didn't even recognize his own life. He wasn't invisible anymore. Yet the change made him uneasy. He hadn't built Loop Mine to be famous. He had built it because no one believed he could. Still, he played the role expected of him. He attended interviews, answered polite questions from reporters, and smiled through endless photo sessions. The principal had turned into a public relations machine, constantly reminding everyone that Elmridge High fostered innovation. But Nolan knew the truth. The school had only opened its eyes after being forced to. Behind the cameras, nothing was perfect. Some teachers whispered that he'd gotten lucky. Others envied the attention. Even now, there were those who waited for him to fail. One evening, after another exhausting day of press visits, Nolan stayed behind in the empty Loop Mine Center. The lights glowed softly, reflecting off the clean glass walls. He sat alone at one of the tables, staring at the logo etched above the main screen. Loop Mind, it read in sleek silver letters. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same system that had once ignored him now wore his name. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, listening to the silence. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, like a question waiting to be answered. He was still lost in thought when the door opened behind him. "You're here late again," came a familiar voice. It was Mrs. Callan. She stood by the doorway, clutching a stack of folders, her tone softer than he'd ever heard it. Nolan opened his eyes but didn't turn. "Just cleaning up," he said quietly. She stepped inside, her heels clicking gently on the polished floor. "You know, I never thought I'd see this place filled with students working after hours," she said. "They used to rush home the second the bell rang." Nolan gave a small smile. Maybe they just needed a reason to stay. She nodded, watching him for a moment. "I read your interview in the Gazette," she said. "You spoke about schools needing to change. You were right." He looked up at her finally. "Change isn't easy," he said. "It takes someone willing to be wrong first." The words hung between them. For a second, she thought he was accusing her, but his tone wasn't bitter. It was matter-of-fact, honest. "I was wrong," she admitted quietly. "I've been wrong about a lot of things. You weren't the only student I pushed too hard. I used to think that being strict was the same as helping. But now I see that fear doesn't teach anything. It only silences people." She hesitated before adding, "You didn't just build an app, Nolan. You built something I never managed to give my students. Confidence." Her words took him by surprise. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He studied her face. She looked older somehow, not in years but in truth. The edge she carried had softened, replaced by humility. "Maybe we both built something," he said finally. "You taught me how to stand up for what I believe, even if it wasn't how you meant to." Mrs. Callan let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "I suppose I'll take that as a compliment." They sat in silence for a few moments, the faint hum of computers filling the room. "There's something else," she said, pulling a folded paper from her folder. "The school board is starting a mentorship program. They want experienced teachers to guide student innovators. I told them I wanted to be part of it, but only if you'd agree to help lead the first session with me." Nolan blinked, genuinely caught off guard. "You want me to co-lead with you?" Yes, she said firmly. If I'm going to teach again, I want to do it differently, and I think I can learn as much from you as my students can. For a long moment, he didn't answer. The idea of working side by side with the woman who had once told him he'd never succeed felt strange, almost unreal. But he saw the sincerity in her eyes. Maybe this was what real progress looked like. Not victory over someone, but change with them. He nodded slowly. All right, I'll do it. Her face brightened in a way he hadn't seen before. Good, she said softly. Maybe this time, we'll both get it right. After she left, Nolan stayed behind a little longer. He looked around the room. The glowing screens, the scattered notebooks, the quiet hum of machines that hadn't existed a month ago. Then he looked at the door she'd just walked through and whispered to himself, Guess some people really can change. Outside, the night air was cool. From the parking lot, the Loop Mine Center shone like a lighthouse in the dark. Not just a room of computers, but a place where the impossible had become real. Nolan walked home slowly, his thoughts clear for the first time in weeks. He had built something that would last, not just in code but in people. And somewhere behind him, in the quiet glow of the new lab, Mrs. Callan sat at one of the desks long after everyone was gone, flipping through a student's notebook. Her fingers lingered on a page of rough sketches, designs for a new app by a freshman she had once ignored. This time, she didn't scold or dismiss it. She smiled. Elmridge High had changed, and so had she. By mid-semester, Elmridge High had turned into something no one could have imagined a few months earlier. The Loop Mine Center wasn't just a room anymore. It had become the heart of the school. Students from different grades mixed freely, working on ideas that went far beyond class assignments. Art students collaborated with coders, science majors helped with design models, and even teachers began visiting during free periods, just to see what their students were building. The energy felt alive in a way that couldn't be graded or scheduled. Every Friday, the mentorship sessions began right after lunch. At first, the idea of Mrs. Callan and Nolan leading together sounded like a joke. Some students even whispered bets about how long it would last before one of them walked out. But something unexpected happened. It worked. Their sessions weren't perfect. Nolan was methodical and calm, while Mrs. Callan was still precise and demanding. But the two balanced each other. He focused on creativity. She focused on clarity. The result was an odd rhythm that made the sessions both disciplined and exciting. On the first day, they had only 8 students. By the third week, the group had grown to nearly 30. Nolan noticed faces he'd never seen before. Students who used to sit at the back of classrooms, always quiet, suddenly raising their hands to share ideas. It reminded him of how he used to feel. Invisible until someone finally looked closer. He didn't tell anyone, but each time he saw a student gaining confidence, it felt like he was undoing a little bit of the past that had once hurt him. Mrs. Callan, meanwhile, was changing in her own way. She still kept her sharp tone when students slacked, but it carried warmth now instead of superiority. She had begun spending her evenings reading about modern teaching methods, trying to understand how to connect instead of control. Once, she even asked Nolan to explain the basics of app design so she could better support her new group. He laughed when she struggled with her first code syntax, but she took it in stride, calling him Professor Gray with a rare grin. Word spread beyond the school walls. The local district invited Nolan and Mrs. Callan to present their mentorship program at an educators' conference in Halver City, the nearest urban district. The idea of standing on another stage together made them both uneasy for different reasons. For Nolan, it brought back the memory of the day he first stood in front of his classmates while she doubted him. For Mrs. Callan, it brought back the sting of humiliation she felt when her mistake was laid bare. But both agreed to go. They didn't owe the world perfection, they owed it honesty. The conference was held in a wide hall filled with teachers, principals, and policymakers. As Nolan and Mrs. Callan stood behind the curtain waiting for their turn, she looked over at him and said quietly, "You know, I used to think a student's success was my reflection. If they failed, I failed. But I was wrong. It was never about me." Nolan smiled. "It's about what they can do when you finally let them try." She nodded. "Exactly." When their turn came, Nolan stepped up to the microphone first. He spoke simply, without notes, telling the story of how the mentorship program began, not with a grant or a plan, but with a mistake and a second chance. The crowd listened closely, nodding at his steady voice. Then he handed the microphone to Mrs. Callan, and she surprised everyone. She admitted everything, how she had misjudged him, how pride had blinded her, and how change had begun only after she decided to listen. I used to think rules protected learning, she said, but I see now that they can also trap it. We don't just teach, we either open doors or close them, and sometimes it takes being wrong to realize which one we've been doing. The audience rose to its feet before she even finished. The applause rolled like thunder through the hall. Nolan didn't look at her while they walked off stage, but he could feel her shoulders shaking slightly, not from fear, but from relief. Afterward, as they stood outside the conference hall, the city lights flickered across glass buildings and car windows. Nolan leaned on the railing, watching the skyline. "You spoke better than most of them," he said. Mrs. Callan gave a soft laugh. "Years of practice telling teenagers what to do, I suppose." He grinned. "You've changed, you know." She glanced at him. "Maybe you did that." "Maybe," he said, "but I think you were ready to." That night on the ride back to Elmridge, the two sat in comfortable silence as the bus rumbled through the empty roads. Mina had stayed behind at the school to supervise a group working late, and Nolan texted her updates from the trip. "Went well. She nailed it," he wrote. Mina replied instantly, "Told you she would. People can surprise you." He stared at that message for a while before replying, "Yeah, they really can." When the bus pulled into the small-town stop, Mrs. Callan gathered her bag and turned to him. "Nolan," she said quietly, "you were right that day. You told me the rules needed an update. I think we're finally writing new ones." He nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Then let's make sure they stay fair this time." As they parted ways outside the school gate, the Loopmine Center lights still glowed in the distance. Students inside were huddled around screens, sketching designs, laughing, building things they once thought were impossible. Neither Nolan nor Mrs. Callan needed to check on them. The work was happening without being told. For the first time since the start of the story, Elmridge High didn't belong to its rules or its teachers or even its reputation. It belonged to its students. And in that quiet, shining building, the future they had all doubted was already beginning to take shape. Winter settled over Elmridge in slow, heavy waves, but the cold didn't stop the life pulsing inside the Loopmine Center. Snow lined the windows while the hum of computers filled the air. Students working in clusters under the soft glow of ceiling lights. Nolan often stayed later than anyone else, his focus deep and unwavering. He wasn't just improving the Loopmind app anymore. He was expanding it into something bigger. The original program had connected students within a school. Now he was building LoopLink, a network to connect schools with one another. He wanted to give students everywhere what he'd had to fight for, a space to be seen. Mina helped coordinate the new team, running meetings, assigning roles, and keeping the energy alive. She joked that Nolan was the mind and she was the mouth, but even she couldn't hide her admiration. "You realize this thing's outgrowing us, right?" she said one evening, leaning over his desk as he typed. "Outgrowing Elmridge? Outgrowing even Marintech." Nolan smiled faintly. "That's the point. I want it to belong to everyone, not just to a company or a name." Mina tilted her head, studying him. "You sound like someone who's already thinking 10 years ahead." "Maybe I am," he said quietly. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the empty schoolyard in white. From her classroom window on the second floor, Mrs. Callan watched the Loopmine Center still glowing, while the rest of the building was dark. She sipped from a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The sight stirred something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet pride that didn't come from grades or reputation, but from growth. Since that first mentorship session, she had rediscovered a version of herself she thought she'd lost. The teacher who cared more about curiosity than control. She thought back to the first day she met Nolan. He had sat alone in the back, head down, absorbed in something on his screen. She had assumed arrogance where there had only been focus, laziness where there had been quiet brilliance. The realization still hurt, but it also drove her forward. She had started staying after hours, helping students she used to overlook, asking questions instead of giving orders. She wasn't perfect, but she was learning again. In her own way, she was becoming a student too. Later that week, the principal called an emergency staff meeting. When everyone gathered in the library, he announced that Marintech was launching a new initiative, the National Loop Program, and Elmridge High had been chosen as its pilot school. There was applause, but beneath it ran a ripple of disbelief. Teachers whispered among themselves. One asked if it was safe for so much attention to rest on one student's creation. Another worried that it would bring pressure the school wasn't ready for. Through it all, Mrs. Callan stayed quiet, watching Nolan from across the room. He looked calm as ever, but she noticed his fingers tapping softly against the table, a sign that his mind was already processing the next 100 steps ahead. After the meeting, she approached him as others left. "You don't look thrilled," she said gently. Nolan gave a small shrug. "It's a lot. This isn't just about code anymore. It's responsibility. That's what growth feels like," she said. "It's not comfortable." He smiled. "You would know." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "You're impossible." They walked together down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the empty school. "When the cameras go away," she said softly, "and the excitement fades, what do you want to do next?" Nolan thought for a long moment before answering. "Teach, maybe," he said finally, "not in the usual way. I want to help kids build things that matter." She stopped, surprised. "Teach?" He nodded. "Someone once told me I'd never succeed. I guess proving them wrong wasn't the hard part. The hard part is making sure no one else hears that sentence again." That answer stayed with her long after they parted ways that night. Over the next few weeks, the program gained momentum. Students from other schools began joining virtual sessions with Elmridge's LoopMind team. The mentorship model spread faster than anyone had expected. Reporters kept calling, but Nolan rarely accepted interviews now. He preferred to stay in the background, letting others speak. Mina became the spokesperson, confident and quick-witted, while Mrs. Callan served as the official advisor. It wasn't lost on anyone how strange it was that the teacher who had once tried to silence Nolan was now helping amplify his vision. Still, success brought new challenges. Marintech wanted more control over LoopLink's future. They began requesting changes, features that prioritized data tracking over learning. Nolan refused quietly at first, then firmly. "This was never about profit," he told Laura Mendez during a video meeting. "If you want numbers, you'll get them from results, not from selling student data." She sighed, clearly frustrated. "You're brilliant, Nolan, but you're idealistic. Business runs on return, not sentiment." He met her gaze through the screen. "Then maybe it's time business learned something new." After the call ended, he sat in silence, staring at the monitor. The glow from the LoopMind logo reflected in his eyes, steady and cold. Mina entered a few minutes later, sensing the tension. "They pushing too hard?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "They're forgetting what we built this for." "Then remind them," she said simply. "It's your vision. Don't let them write over it." Outside, the wind howled through the dark, rattling the windows. Snowflakes pressed against the glass like tiny ghosts of the past. Fragile, fleeting, but countless. Nolan rubbed his tired eyes, then opened a new window on his laptop. He began typing a line of code, a new layer of encryption, stronger and cleaner. It wasn't for protection against hackers. It was for something more important. He was securing the heart of the system, ensuring that no matter who owned it on paper, LoopMind would always belong to the students. Hours later, as the lights dimmed and the building went quiet, Mrs. Callan walked past the LoopMind Center on her way out. Through the glass. She saw him still there, hunched over his keyboard, the same determination on his face she had mistaken for arrogance once. She smiled softly, shaking her head. "You'll never stop, will you?" she whispered under her breath. Then she turned off the hallway lights, leaving him in that small island of glow. A boy, a teacher, and a dream that refused to end. And somewhere deep in that stillness, Nolan pressed the final key, sealing the code with a quiet certainty. Whatever came next, he was ready. Spring arrived at Elmridge quietly, the snow melting from the rooftops and the air softening with the smell of rain. The LoopMind Center, now the pride of the town, hummed with constant activity. New posters lined the walls showing student inventions. Solar notebooks, recycling drones, even a group project that created music from brainwave sensors. Every corner seemed alive with imagination, every table a miniature world of creation. Nolan had become something of a legend, but fame never sat comfortably on him. He spent most days quietly observing others, helping when needed, then fading back into the background as though he didn't exist at all. By now, his partnership with Marintech had reached a breaking point. Their executives had grown impatient with his refusal to monetize the student network. They wanted advertisements, premium subscriptions, and data tracking. He wanted freedom, privacy, and education. The difference was more than a disagreement. It was a wall. "They'll try to control you," Mina warned one evening as they sat by the glowing screens of the lab. "They already are," Nolan replied softly. He showed her the latest email from Laura Mendez, her tone no longer polite, but corporate and cold. "Our board will require access to the full database by next quarter. Continued resistance may affect your contractual status." Mina read it twice, frowning. "You think they'd really cut you off?" Nolan leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling lights. "They might, but if I give in, then everything this place stands for dies. It's supposed to be a bridge, not a business." She sighed. "So what now?" His voice was calm but certain. "We take it back." The next week was a blur. Nolan and a handful of students, Mina, Jacob, and 2 seniors who handled security systems, worked late into the night. They coded in shifts, building a completely new framework independent of Marintech servers. LoopLink would be reborn, but this time it would belong entirely to the students who used it. No investors, no board, no contracts. They called the new version Loop-Free. It was bold, risky, and possibly career-ending, but Nolan didn't care. He'd seen too many people build things just to have them stolen. Meanwhile, Mrs. Callan began to sense that something was wrong. She noticed the lights on in the LoopMind Center every night long after curfew, the tired eyes of her students in mourning, classes, and the growing silence between Nolan and Mina. At first, she thought it was another project, but one evening, when she stopped by the lab, she found them all huddled over screens filled with code that didn't look like LoopMind at all. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly from the doorway. No one spoke at first. Then Nolan closed his laptop gently and stood. "Finishing what I started." She frowned. "You already finished. You built something incredible." He shook his head. "Not if someone else owns it." Her brow furrowed. "Are you breaking your contract?" "I'm fixing my mistake," he said. "I gave control to people who only see numbers. I can't let them turn students into data. They'll sell their focus, their creativity, their future, and call it progress." Mrs. Callan looked at him for a long time. "You could lose everything." He nodded. "Then I'll start again. But this time, no one can take it." For a moment she didn't speak. Then she sighed softly, her expression changing from disapproval to something closer to pride. "Do it right, Nolan. Not out of anger, but purpose." He smiled faintly. "I learned that from you." She stayed for a while, quietly watching as they worked, the students typing with a mix of fear and excitement. For the first time in years, she saw what learning was supposed to look like. Not memorization or pressure, but discovery. She realized this was the kind of education no classroom could ever contain. Over the next few days, Marintech noticed the drop in activity on their servers. Laura Mendez called repeatedly, her tone rising from concern to fury. When Nolan finally answered, her voice was sharp. "You're tampering with company property." "I'm protecting student work," he replied evenly. "You're voiding your agreement." "Then it was never the right one." "You'll lose our funding, your position, everything." "Maybe, but I'll keep my freedom." There was silence on the other end, then a curt, "You'll regret this, Nolan." The call ended. That night, the group gathered for what Nolan called the handover. He uploaded the final build of Loop-Free onto independent servers, encrypted it beyond Marintech's reach, and then pressed deploy. The screens blinked once, and the system went live. Every student account, every school connection, transferred seamlessly. The new platform spread like wildfire. Within 48 hours, Loop-Free had more users than the original version. The network had outgrown its parent before it even learned to crawl. Mina watched the progress bar finish, her voice barely above a whisper. You just walked away from $1 million deal. Nolan closed the laptop, his tone calm. Money's replaceable. Trust isn't. 2 days later, Marintech terminated the partnership. The company issued a statement filled with polished words about strategic redirection, but everyone knew what it meant. The media tried to spin it as arrogance from a young prodigy. Yet students everywhere rallied around him, sharing hashtags like Loop Free for All and Shakshan Students First. The story spread faster than the company could control. At school, things were quieter but different. The principal received both praise and warnings from the district office. Some teachers called Nolan reckless, others called him brave. Through it all, Mrs. Callan stood by him. When reporters asked about the situation, she gave one simple answer. Education doesn't belong to corporations. It belongs to those who use it to grow. Late one evening, when the uproar had finally started to settle, Nolan sat alone in the Loopmind Center, the hum of machines steady and low. The light of the monitors cast a pale glow across his face. He wasn't smiling, but there was peace in his eyes. Mina entered quietly and sat beside him without speaking. They didn't need words. The numbers on the screen spoke for them. Millions of active students connected freely, learning together without restriction. From the doorway, Mrs. Callan watched for a moment before turning off the last of the hallway lights. "You did it," she said softly. Nolan didn't look up. "No," he said, his voice steady. "We did." Outside, the spring wind carried the faint sound of laughter from a group of students walking home. The night was quiet, the town still, and the once-forgotten school now stood as a symbol of something greater than success, proof that one act of defiance could rebuild a system. And as Nolan leaned back in his chair, staring at the endless line of glowing dots on the screen, students learning, connecting, creating, he knew that this wasn't an ending. It was just the next version, the next line of code, the next chapter waiting to be written. Summer came early that year, warm winds brushing through the trees that surrounded Elmridge High. The Loopmind Center still buzzed every day, but now it carried a different kind of energy. Not the rush of competition or the fear of failure, but quiet pride. The walls that had once echoed with disbelief now shimmered with stories of what could happen when someone refused to give up. Nolan Gray had changed the rhythm of the school, but more importantly, he had changed the rhythm of belief. Loop Free had grown beyond anything anyone expected. Schools from other towns joined, teachers requested partnerships, and the district began using Nolan's open-source framework to teach coding and collaboration. He never tried to claim ownership again. "It belongs to the students," he would say whenever someone asked. That was always the point. On a warm afternoon, the school held a small celebration. There were no cameras, no reporters, just students, teachers, and families gathered around the courtyard. Mina stood beside Nolan, laughing as younger students showed off small apps they had built using his code. Mrs. Callan watched from the side, her smile softer than anyone had ever seen. When Nolan noticed her, he walked over, holding 2 paper cups of lemonade. He handed her one and said, "You ever think we'd end up here?" She laughed. "If you told me a year ago that I'd be teaching in a lab named after your app, I'd have sent you to detention for lying." He smiled. "Guess we both learned something." They stood in silence for a moment, watching students run past, voices full of laughter. "You know," Mrs. Callan said, "you could have stopped after proving me wrong. Most people would have, but you didn't." Nolan looked around at the students' building, talking, sharing ideas like they'd been waiting their whole lives to be heard. "That's because success isn't about proving someone wrong," he said quietly. "It's about helping others get it right." As the sun dipped low, turning the sky to gold, Mina called everyone together for a group photo. Teachers, students, parents, the faces of those who had witnessed something rare. Nolan stood in the middle, not as a genius or a rebel, but as a reminder that every voice, no matter how small, can spark change if it's brave enough to speak. Later that night, the lights in the Loopmind Center flickered off one by one. The building stood in calm silence, a symbol of what could grow from courage and second chances. And when the video for the Waves of Justice channel faded in, the final narration began. Nolan's voice, steady and clear. There will always be someone who tells you that you can't, that you're not enough, that you don't belong, that your dream is too big or your idea too small. Let them talk, because sometimes being underestimated is the best motivation you'll ever get. Don't chase approval, chase purpose. Don't wait for permission, build your own door. Because justice isn't only found in courts or laws. Sometimes it's found in proving that kindness, effort, and belief can rewrite every rule that ever tried to hold you down. As the music swelled softly, the channel's message appeared on the screen in bold white letters. This is Waves of Justice, where stories remind us that silence breaks, truth rises, and hope always finds its voice. Then the narrator's final line carried the emotion of every struggle and every victory that had come before it. If this story moved you, don't just watch, share it, comment your thoughts, and subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another dreamer needs to hear that one voice can still change everything. The screen faded to black. The wave of justice rolled on,